Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy. Today we're in Deuteronomy chapter 14. We're looking at verses 3 through 21. Now in this section, we find Moses giving the regulations for what kinds of food you are allowed to eat and what kinds of food you are not allowed to eat. He's talking about the difference between clean and unclean foods. Now we saw at the beginning of chapter 14, Moses had told the people they were to be distinct from the Canaanites. They were to be a people set apart. And so this section is part of that. Even in the way you eat, what you will eat, what you will not eat, you show yourself to be distinct from the Canaanite people, a people set apart. Foods are classified as either clean or unclean. Let's read a few verses. Now, do not eat any detestable things. Don't eat anything that's unclean. These are the animals that you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, and the ibex, the antelope, the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. However, of those that chew the cud or that have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel or the rabbit or the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean. Although it has a divided hoof, it does not chew the cud. You are not to eat their meat or touch their carcasses. There are more regulations that follow. But notice the distinction between foods that are clean and foods that are unclean. Now, when we read these dietary restrictions, we're a little confused. Why are some foods clean? Why are some foods unclean? Why are you allowed to eat some types of food and not other types? Now we know when we get to the New Testament, this is not a matter of morality or of sin, because in the New Testament, the dietary laws are declared obsolete. And you remember Peter's vision in the book of Acts where he sees this sheep being let down with all kinds of animals he's told to kill and eat. He says, I won't eat anything unclean. And God said, don't call it unclean if I've called it clean. So we understand from this that these food laws of the Old Testament were not matters of morality or of sin, but rather of clean and unclean. Now we're going to come back to that later and talk a little bit more about that, but just sort of keep that distinction in your mind. Some foods were clean, some were unclean. Now when we get to the end of this section, which is in verse 21, all these regulations are closed with this comment: because you are a people holy to the Lord your God. You are people set apart for God. And even in what you eat, you show that you belong to God by eating only that which God has said is clean, not that which is declared unclean. Now, if you remember, these dietary laws are also talked about in the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 11, we find the same regulations for clean and unclean food. Chapter 11 of Leviticus has a few more details, but it's essentially the same list of that which is clean food and that which is unclean food. At the end of chapter 11, notice how it closes these regulations. We're in Leviticus 11, verses 46 and 47. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves about in the water, and every creature that moves along the ground. You must distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. So the matter of the dietary laws make a distinction between that which is clean and that which is unclean. Something that was unclean makes you unable to worship the Lord. We're going to see that in some detail tomorrow. But something that is unclean makes you unable to go into the sanctuary and worship the Lord. That which is clean allows you to approach the sanctuary and worship the Lord. So by these dietary laws, the Israelites were told over and over again, keep yourself clean. Don't do things that make you unable to worship. Make a distinction between clean and unclean, between that which allows you to worship and that which prohibits you from worship, because you belong to the Lord your God, and you don't want anything to keep you from worshiping. So in what they ate, the matter of the food laws, there was an object lesson about always keep in mind the difference between being clean and being unclean, because you belong to the Lord. Those things that are unclean make you unable to worship. those things which are clean allow you to worship. And as God's people, you always want to be able to enter his presence and to worship. So make that distinction between the clean and the unclean. We're going to talk a little more detail tomorrow about this clean and unclean business, but we've got the basic idea now. And for us, that means we want to be clean in our life. We don't want to allow anything in our life that prevents us from worshiping. In Old Testament terms, what is unclean makes it impossible for you to enter the sanctuary. So you want to be clean. You always want to keep your life in a place where you're able to enter the presence of God and worship him. And so this matter of clean and unclean food has to do with remembering that you must always be in a state, or try to keep yourself in a state, where you can enter the presence of the Lord to worship. We'll look a little more detail at this tomorrow. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy.